All right, we're live. All right, yeah. I got my haircut. Looks all wet. It isn't. It just looks wet. I got my coffee. My beer. IPA. So I've been kind of a neckbeard troll. Last week or so, I've been making a bunch of videos. This one in particular, I think, is going to suit your fancy. Certainly suits mine. It's on the whatchamacallit, the nation of England or Britain as it evolved from the early Middle Ages to the very end of the Middle Ages, the so-called late Middle Ages, which you may as well consider like the English Renaissance. Although there is some dispute regarding the matter of whether or not there was an English Renaissance. So to begin, as you know, this particular series and even the channel by and large is dedicated to a lot of German and sort of French and sort of Italian, Central European operatic nations, their content, their sort of memorial, continental Europe. But England obviously is of chief importance just because I speak English and I'm Anglophonic. My heritage is very much English, maybe not predominantly, but a plurality of my ancestors came from England, Southern England or Northern. And I just think I have to talk about England if I'm going to speak to an English audience. So I guess the skinny here is that England in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, post-classical era, whatever you want to call it, was not a serious empire or really a strong Christian kingdom for hundreds of years until it basically started feuding with France over hegemony in the North Sea, the English Channel area around the North Sea. So England was a fraction of its size because it didn't oversee Scotland or Wales or definitely not Ireland. And it was fragmented into like a sort of a loose confederacy, if you will, of petty pagan and Christian kingdoms. In the 600s, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes invaded England from ostensibly northern Germany or Denmark, southern, the kind of the armpit there between Denmark and Germany on the west coast. And they left because of just sort of not for any one particular resource crisis that can be discerned, but because of a general pattern of migration during this period all around Europe. Down, much of that was going down to Spain and Italy and even North Africa before it was called North Africa. And the Roman Empire was still sort of this dream that in people's heads. And many of the German tribes didn't really see that as viable. And so they paved their own way through force of strength and a little bit of nautical ingenuity. And they sailed to England fresh, brighter shores or whatever the parlance is. And they landed on those shores and they pillaged and they conquered. And honestly, they had some technological superiority against the native British because the native British were acclimated to a kind of a Roman government, but the Roman government was not very well equipped to deal with any invasion, especially since the Roman Empire had been dwindling and kind of capsized in this well before the 600s. And so when they were invaded, they had some very interesting interactions with the Anglo-Saxons, where they basically had a few battles that they won, and under like the flag of Rome, they won defensively, and those key battles didn't really matter in the long run, but they had a legendary quality, like overnight almost. And the stories of King Arthur are predominantly stories about just the sort of dress up the the mythic defense of England from the Anglo-Saxons, because there was believed to be a Roman leader, and then his brother was named Uther Pendragon, which sounds hard to believe. This is all from Gildas and a few others. Geoffrey of Monmouth is another one, the big one, I guess. And then this battle of battles, the brother of the leader dies, I think, in the battle, and then the brother survives, and his name is Uther Pendragon, and his son is Arthur Pendragon. And the whole cycle of Britain, which involving Arthur and the Round Table, Lancelot, you know, Galahad, you know, Gawain, you know, Parsifal, even Tristan is sold, you know, even that all kind of originates from this not really a resistance to the Anglo-Saxon invasion, but a sort of romanticization of alleged accounts of that resistance, because their resistance was kind of futile in the long run. Now the Anglos and the Saxons conquered, but they didn't conquer in unison. They carved up different landscapes and allowed different areas to take ownership. And this doesn't really play into the English history in any important way, except for the fact that by tendency, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, which is a smaller faction, they had different religious ideas, and some were more predisposed to Christianity and Christian thought, and others were less predisposed. And so, if my memory serves me right, I think, you know, like the Saxons stayed pagan, and the Anglos were more inclined towards Christianity. They had a lot of wars, infighting, like civil wars, battles mostly. I mean, you call them wars, but just, you know, stretched out series of battles or whatever, sequence of battles, right? And eventually, Christianity was actually less and less popular, to the point that it almost disappeared entirely on England. And there was one guy from the Sutton Hoo excavation who was the last uh, Christian sort of petty king, and he dies in safety, and then his sons take over his army, and they are able to sort of outmaneuver the pagan opposition, the rival kings, and they start spreading it one kingdom by kingdom, and then Christianity ends up spreading even more and more. This is big news. This means England is finally not Christianized, but just the war over religion in England is gone, and now Christianity has momentum again. And basically, it actually keeps momentum. It stays in order. Only problem is that now new invaders want to show up, and those are Vikings. And the Vikings show up, and they also want to chip away at Christianity, but Christianity is more consolidated now, because the Anglo-Saxons all embraced it, and so they know that that their ancestors were pagan. So they're very aware that they're choosing to be Christians. It's not like nowadays where like people are just Christian loosely and they don't even know why, and they question it a lot. Back then, um, unless you were very dim-witted or sort of just like a loudmouth simpleton, you were likely to understand why you're being Christian, and you had sort of a political understanding of it as well. Now, eventually, the the Vikings invade. You know, the most famous one is the Great Heathen Army, the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. You know, they invade, and different sons like Ivar the Boneless goes up to the north and Strathclyde in Scotland, and in the south you have like Ubba, I think, and Halfdan. You know, all these different, or maybe Ubba was in Ireland. Guthrum was in southern England. These famous. There's a lot of great stories about these Viking warriors, but they really were not the best people. They were kind of invading, trying to get better farming conditions for their people, and they're trying to conquer all of the Anglo-Saxon territory, England. And the irony was that Anglo-Saxons had invaded in fought the Roman British subjects and basically destroyed their whole language system and forced them to learn what's now English. The original inhabitants of Britain, a lot of people don't know this. The original inhabitants of Britain did not speak English. They spoke British, Brythonic is what it's really called. It's called Brythonic, but you can think of it as British. And it was not really written down, except the Romans, when they showed up, Emperor Claudius conquered England. They enforced the standardization to an appreciable degree of the Roman alphabet, and that meant that the British language had to sort of fall in line with that alphabet, and they started writing inscriptions with Roman letters. This is not like as cool of a story as it sounds, because the Anglo-Saxons, when they took hold of the land, whatever they call it, not Hibernia, but Albion or whatever. When they took over Albion, or maybe not, there's no real word, but they took over Great Britain. When they did southern Britain, and they created these divisions like Northumbria, Wessex, Essex, Cornwall, Mercia. When they created these smaller kingdoms, because there were like 4 or 5 like bigger kingdoms that became Christian, but before they were Christian, there were even smaller kingdoms in all these areas. And then once it became Christian, there was less kingdoms. So the Christianization made less kingdoms, but with more land. And it also enshrined this idea of nativism, where it's like, yeah, we're Anglo-Saxons, but we really are the shepherds of this territory. And so when the Vikings invade, even though they ostensibly have the same motive, like, we're just going to take land, pillage, take money, rape, take women, we're just going to conquer. The idea that the unification of the Christians under their Christ figurehead allowed them to sort of cooperate enough that they actually could defend against the Vikings, and they ended up keeping England for themselves. The guy who was most famous for winning this was King Alfred the Great of Wessex, and this was before London was really even a big deal. I think his capital was west of London, out in the more in the marshland, but I could be mistaken about its exact location. And for a while, the Vikings owned a lot of these entire areas, entire swaths of land that the Vikings owned, and it was really like a Cold War between the Danes and the English, the Angles, right? And the York was the town up in Northumbria, it was called Eboracum by the Romans. It was called Jorvik by the Danes. That land was pretty much part of the Danelaw. So the Danish owned it, and that was their current power base. And it's a little bit like a Gondor versus Mordor attitude. Like, yeah, they're over there and they're scary, and we have to go and defeat them, or else they're going to destroy the world. Really, like, high stakes, Christian versus pagan tensions, and eventually the Kingdom of Wessex sort of helps reunite Mercia and Northumbria, and I don't know the other little kingdoms that fell out of relevance. Hold on, let me get my charger. So that all happens, and it's here, I'm gonna fall on the bed. Like, just to charge. Yeah, I mean, I should probably read more up on this stuff, but just to keep the ball rolling, because I forgot a lot of detail, and some detail I just never considered learning until now. But I will say that the big picture is just as important as the little picture. And the Christians, they when when they conquered um, England and then defended it from the Vikings, they forced the Vikings southward because the Vikings could no longer really conquer England. They actually conquered major cities in Ireland, and a lot of the cities like Dublin and I think Cork and possibly Galway were Viking strongholds that kind of fell out of circulation and settled back into being Irish. But their foundation was Viking, and that is kind of the reason why they even existed, because the Irish weren't really seafaring, but the Vikings are extremely seafaring. So those port cities were really established by the Vikings. And they did a little bit of that in Scotland and England, but in Ireland they went kind of wild with it. And eventually, though, they got kind of kicked out of Ireland because it was hard to really conquer Ireland. For the Vikings never really conquered anywhere. The only place that they were able to set up control in permanently was Iceland, of course, which hardly relevant. Part of Greenland, hardly relevant, and very relevant, Normandy. And the way they did this was they kind of they had been invading France, just like England, but they never really were able to conquer a lot. And at one point, they did finally get it done, and they convinced the King of France to give them Rollo was the Viking's name. Give him control of Normandy, and let him land in as a duke, and his whole family could run Normandy, and he would be subservient to the King of France, but one of the most powerful people in France. And really, like it sounds like he was just like negotiated it, but the historical record points to him picking up the King of France in his own throne room and throwing him on the ground and demanding that he make him Duke of Normandy. The Vikings literally forced their way into French royalty. And that is extremely relevant because it's just scratching my nose, but because eventually his descendants, William the Bastard, he also had a guy called William the Longsword who was important, but William the Bastard invades England and conquers England in 1066, and famously at the Battle of Hastings on the coast of the southern England, the southern coast, and that's one of the most important battles in world history. Literally, England became subjugated to this particular family's dynasty, and a lot of castles were built because castles in England, like King England, was up until 1066 was basically a backwater. Like their castles were not very sophisticated; they were just kind of hill forts. But then the French castles had been more like we're not just earthenwork or whatever, and like some wooden palisades. They had real like built up fortresses, towers, and stuff. And so they went all around England and start building castles. And actually, they took them a while to build castles everywhere because the Norman dynasty that took over England, they had to invade Wales and Scotland. And once they invaded Wales, Edward the First he installed castles there to protect his interests as king. And so everywhere they could get more land, they would build more castles over generations. So the Normans, and they changed a lot of the culture in England, which is kind of key. Like the Robin Hood mythology has a lot to do with resisting the Norman corruption, because the aristocracy was now speaking French, but they were also supposed to speak English, but they didn't really care about the English peasants. Because most of the time they lived in the old French lands anyway, which was about the size of England. So they had a lot of land in France to govern too. It was called the Angevin dynasty. And like the word beef and pork and stuff, those words were not Anglo-Saxon Germanic words. They came from French, that old French from near Paris. And because the cuts of meat were expensive, and they were, like just because it was what they had to live with all the time. So because they were the only one, it was considered, they got to choose the words. And so England was kind of like, not only was it more relevant around 11th century than it had ever been, but it was also not even really English. Like William the Conqueror, he did a survey of
of England called a famous one called the Domesday Book, where he went from every town and assessed how much land the farmers owe and how much pigs they have, and well, he collected a whole book. Very expensive to do this just to write the document, but then actually going around and surveying the countryside was enormously expensive. But he wanted to know what the land that he owned as the king of as a new king of England, and this is the first time they'd done this. Like they never surveyed the land up until 1066. So now it was more of a big deal. It was being like legitimately considered by the nobility as like part of the administration of Europe in a way. Um, they weren't fighting over Christian versus pagan anymore. It was just, how do we consolidate this so that we can get as much money out of it and as possible. And but the irony was that the French considered it like an extension of their land, even though all those people didn't speak French, but they just considered it. I say the French, the nobles in France considered it like a colony, and for a while it sort of was. Um, but that kind of chips away when you get more and more crusades, and the peasants start to notice that the king's not around that much because he's off fighting in the crusades, and uh, he's losing, or he's fighting against the king of France because he owns all this land in France, and the French king wants it. Philip II, he wants it, and so the English are losing their kind of like their big claim to France. They're losing that, and now so they're kind of fucked both ways because they don't have their like sovereignty as an English people. They're run by this Norman dynasty, but at the same time, the Norman dynasty in France, which was a lot of land all the way down southward, going down to Bordeaux, it's being chipped away to the point that it's rather losing stake. And what ends up happening is that the English get really pissed that they're in this crisis, and there's a lot. It becomes pressure to go to war with the King of France, um, after they'd already lost in violation of I believe a treaty, or sort of just like the old terms from the last war. And so this begins the Hundred Years' War, where they just sort of boldly attack France for no reason, because they had lost so much land that they didn't have pride, and they just as an act of arrogance, they just instigate a war with France for 116 years, called the Hundred Years' War. Famously, Joan of Arc is like the mascot for the French resistance of the English invasion. And for a while, the English actually win key battles despite tactical, like strategically logistical issues. They use good tactics to win key battles, but eventually, the French peasantry has more spirit for defending France because they realize they're being totally invaded. It took them a while to wake up to the fact that they're just being invaded. And so once they realized it, with the help of people like Joan of Arc, who were rather spirited, they were able to repel the English. And this kind of shows the rest of Europe that England is kind of a beast when it wants to be. But up until then, I think England was considered a third-rate place. It was not it was a Johnny come lately to Christianity. There was a lot of civil wars going on. The Vikings are constantly raiding it. It was kind of a frontier land for Europe. It wasn't like northern Italy, or like Magdeburg in Germany, or Barcelona even in Spain, or like certain places in Europe that were just like mainstays of European society, like Genoa, or what's another one that's kind of more interesting? Prague, perhaps. Let's say like Prague. Like that place would have been the mainstay by now, and they would have looked at England like sort of like it had a kind of a mental problem. And England lost its 100 Years' War and immediately plummets into a civil war again It's called the War of the Roses, so they're not really doing anything impressive. And this is in I think the 1300s where it kicks up again with the War of the Roses, and they're not doing anything impressive. So by the time you get to the late Middle Ages, England has kind of done nothing in terms of its culture. It's, I mean, there's the Canterbury Tales, and there's some nice stained glass in cathedrals here and there. But like England is not like a globally important place, or even a regionally super important place. It's really important as a buffer between the Viking invaders and places like France and Germany. All right, so that's it. I was just trying to explain England, what England was up to from the year 600 to about 1300, 1350. Eventually, the Tudor dynasty takes over with Henry VIII, and not because so much Henry VIII, but because of the land in Europe becoming more and more consolidated under the Holy Roman Empire, and there being a strong interest in resisting the Holy Roman Empire, England ends up being kind of like a deciding factor because it does have a higher population than it ever did in the 1500s. So it becomes kind of a deciding factor in brokering alliances, not as much as you'd expect it to be based on how it talks about itself, but just more so than it had ever been before. And even in the 1500s, England, it was exploring territories in the New World, but it was mostly doing this because it had nothing better to do. It could build a navy to rival Spain over time, but initially it wouldn't even be able to do that. It just had to take the land that Spain wasn't occupied. Like the land in the New World, much of the land was claimed by Spain, and the English were just sneaking in and stealthily occupying it, kind of stealing the land from the Spanish, who had stolen it from the natives or whatever. I mean, I don't really know like which land was native or not, but because some land was considered just free for all. But it was the English were not like doing anything amazing. I mean, you go out to China, like the Ming Dynasty is like way more impressive, than what the Tudors are up to. The Tudors, yeah, they had Shakespeare. I think that was kind of like the dawn of their culture, and some people consider that the English Renaissance. But really, they weren't up to a lot of painting, and they never really had a ton of great painters, even after the Renaissance. And I think England has always been sort of like a scarcely relevant place. I mean, the composers even later centuries, most of them didn't come from England. They came from Germany, Austria, France, or Italy. And that's just a fact. Italian and German composers and painters far more relevant. And if you really want me to like pinpoint why English weren't as important, I would say it's because the Dutch were very close to England, but their trade routes were a lot more connected to mainland Europe. And the Dutch, I mean, literally, they're the lowlands, but they're still connected to Europe. They're on Europe. And the Dutch had a lot better painters because they had better access to pigments, and they had better access to metals that they could sculpt. They kind of had more resources and more of an and they were running in a more educated society, so they could learn from masters more quickly. So the Dutch were kind of the reason why England, like all the best people, were concentrated in the Netherlands, which at the time wasn't even called that. It's called like Dutch Spain or something. So, yeah, 30 minutes. I think that's the best I can do. I hope the stream is it didn't stop or anything. And again, I just want to give you a brief overview of England's role in the Middle Ages and how it rose to power slowly but surely, yet really didn't play a significant factor in the decision making in Central Europe or Southern Europe. It kind of just wasn't all that involved. And for good reason. It was busy establishing its own place in the world. It had to focus more inwardly and had to learn how to defend itself. It had low self-esteem. Anyway, I'll leave it there. The economy just really the fact of the matter is the economy was nothing to be wowed by. And it took a while for the English economy to really serve everyone else. Okay, that's it. They had minerals, but they didn't have a lot of, and some textiles and stuff, but they didn't have a lot of fine artisanry. They had some stained glass experts, but they didn't have a lot of like, they weren't known for like, their goldsmiths or something. They didn't have the urban population. Anyway, that's it.